Hello. So I'm Magnus, and I'm with Millenium Management. We are a global investment management firm with offices all around the world. We're about 3,000 people and been around for about 25 years. So I want to share some of the experience we had as of date to using DataSync. Okay, that was the intro. So we have a ton of data. We just have a lot of data everywhere. And some of the data we have on NFS filers sitting on-premise. We want to make sure that all of that data is available if we have some sort of disaster on-premise. We want to make sure we have it available off-premise. We also have compliance requirements as well, so have that available up to 7 years, right? So we want to take snapshots of this fairly frequently, about at least once a week. And then with that, we want to be able to restore individual files or complete file systems if we have to. And we want to do this at a very large scale, right? So we're talking about petabytes of data. We're talking about billions of files. 7 years is a long time, though, so we want to make sure that if we do put all this data in one place, that we have the capability to get it out and put it somewhere else. We want to avoid that, avoid that lock-in, right? And also, if you do move all of that data into the cloud, it would be great if you can actually make use of it, be able to access it and apply it to some other uses as well, right? So we looked at three main categories of different solutions out there. We looked at the kind of the traditional tape, virtual tape solutions. We kind of discounted them pretty quickly. There's a lot of things we actually want to get away from. We're looking then at kind of two categories of a little bit more modern, a little bit more cloud-native solutions. One is kind of block-level replication, where essentially you detect a change on the block on-premise, and then that gets replicated up. Then you have software on top of that figures out, okay, what blocks becomes a file or a file system, keeps track of the different snapshots and stuff like that. All pretty great solutions, but they have two kind of big issues. One, it doesn't get to the scale that we want to get to. And also, there's somewhat of a lock-in. It's pretty easy to get the data in there, but it's fairly hard to kind of pull that out and then put that somewhere else. Then we have the file-level replication, which is including DataSync, which just takes a change in the file on-premise and then copies that, replicates that over into the cloud. And then it meets what we have in all the previous slides if we add in versioning to that object store as well. So if you use DataSync, we have to turn on S3 versioning as well to make that work. And that works pretty well. It's obviously not as kind of efficient when it comes to like the bits and bytes as block level. So that's kind of a negative, but they're much better at combining that with moving things into different storage classes. So we can easily move those things into Glacier or into Deep Archive, and it makes it quite cost efficient as well. So that's what we decided to do. We're going to use DataSync. We're going to use it with S3 versioning. So how do we now get there from having nothing to have it up and running and kind of weekly doing these recurring syncs? And we started pretty early. We actually started earlier than DataSync was really ready for us. So we started by ordering a whole bunch of snowballs, starting loading data onto those snowballs, sent them up, and put that into S3. One important point, which is a good lesson learned, is that we didn't have the metadata available to us. We didn't have the requirements for it. It was a little bit too early. So we had to send up all this data without all the metadata that DataSync uses to kind of keep track of all the files and all the information. So that was kind of part of that, and later we'll see what that means. Then at the same time, we're starting to build out all the infrastructure that we needed to do these things, right? So we put in hardware on-premise, where we're going to run all the agents. We also provisioned a direct connect, where we're going to do all the transfers across, and kind of have that whole piece there, right? And as we built that out, we very quickly realized that with the scale that we were doing all this with, all the complexities that came along with it, we definitely need to automate all of this. The APIs that are there are good. They're not that complicated, but at this scale, we really had to build something that was kind of fit for purpose for what we tried to do. So we kind of built a management logic on top of that as well. And in the next slide, I will go into some detail of that as well. So now we're actually ready to do this first sync. And we run this first sync. And if you remember, I mentioned metadata. What happens when you do the sync, DataSync is great. It figures out what's there, what's not there. You're just sending up the delta. But because we didn't have the metadata, it needed to add all that metadata in too, right? So we had it all there sitting with the metadata going forward. The problem with S3 versioning when you do that, though, is that metadata cannot be inline updated. Essentially has to be another copy put to it. So as part of this process, we essentially doubled all the storage. I mean, we're talking petabyte scale storage. That's not really the place we want to end up. So we had to build an additional piece of software that essentially went through all of that and cleaned all of that up for us, right? So that's a good lesson to share with all of you. All right, but now we have everything up there. Everything is sitting in a good state. And now we can start adding in some logic to our software that schedules everything, put in alerts and stuff like that. And with this in place, we can now start doing recurring syncs. And we cannot forget, though, that we also need to be able to restore, right? Individual files is actually quite easy. We can use the CLI, we can use the SDK, we can just ask for the files to be sent to us, right? So that's quite easy. The good thing with the DataSync as well is that we can actually reverse the process. So if we wanted to get a file system back, we can actually just reverse DataSync and off we go, right? All right, so digging into a little bit of that box I had for that management of this. So one of the key things that we decided first was that we're going to create some DynamoDB tables where we're actually going to store the long-term information about all our backup jobs. So the source, the targets, what schedule we're going to run them on, all kind of information that we want to keep track of them. And then we have some scripts. We essentially have flat files. We can load them, and they will update these tables, either new things or things that needs to be updated. We capture all those things through DynamoDB streams. We have a Lambda functions that detects all of these things, and then check with what's in DataSync to see, okay, is what we want to have there, is that actually there? And one of the things that this does is that there's certain things in DataSync you can't actually update just with a single command or in line. A great example is agents, for example. Agents are kind of pinned to locations, which defines where things are, which is then kind of put together with tasks. So if we want to change agents and what agents to use, we essentially have to tear everything down and build everything back up, right? And this function kind of just automates all that for us and kind of keeps everything in the state that we want to have it, right? All right, so we have the tables, we're tracking all the information, we have everything now in DataSync. Where we kind of want to have it, we now can start actually kicking things off, right? So we have a Lambda function that runs every 5 minutes, and it checks, what's the schedule of jobs, what things are supposed to run. It also checks the state of the agent to see, okay, what agents are actually available, and then matches that up and kicks things off. The thing it does in addition to that, which I think is kind of a key thing to make this work at scale, is to detect what agents are actually not busy, what agents are actually having no queue of jobs coming to them, have nothing going on for them, and then start reassigning the different jobs to those. So if you have a stable of agents, make sure you utilize them all the time and kind of reassign things and do some resource management across that. We also do some detection of things that might not go as we expect, things taking longer, is there more data there, and then send alerts to us to alert us, and we can take some action on that as well. We are listening to anything coming out of DataSync, all the different events. We make sure we keep track of those. any timings, what number of files that are happening, and any of those things. So we later on can produce reports to this, right? So we want to see what happened with the last run. We also might want to see happens over time, right? Are we sending more data? Are things taking longer? Are things taking quicker? You know, what happens, right? We built a lot of this before some of the latest features came out. So some of these things are there now in the service, which is great, and other things we are hoping would come sometime in the future. All right, so we have all of that set up. We have all these files. We have all the management software. So talk a little about scale and timing, right? So for us, like I mentioned, we have petabytes of data that we're doing this with. We have billions of files. On a weekly basis, we don't have more than, it's going to be less than 10% of files are changing, right? So we don't have a wholesale change of everything. We run these of 17 agents, 64 gig of RAM for each one of them. And we have, like I mentioned before, we have a dedicated connection, a 10 gig connection where we do all the transfers across, right? And doing this, it's never taking us more than 4 days to run this, right? It usually actually takes 2.5 to 3 days, so it'll be quicker than that, but it's never taking more than 4 days to run this. And again, this is for, this is for kind of the ongoing sync as we go on, right? This, for the initial one, it definitely would take longer if you have a lot of data. So, all right. Last slide before I hand it back to Jeff and Paul. So some of the lessons learned as we've gone through this. There's a number of different phases that DataSync goes through. A couple of main ones are the preparation and the transfer phase. The one that is actually the most intense one is the preparation phase, which is essentially where DataSync figures out what are the files that actually has changed. It actually does a scan of everything, right? That's really what is doing really well, but also what you're going to realize later is that that's really what you're going to optimize against. You will need to make sure that that works really well. If that works well, your syncs are going to work well. Like I mentioned before, we have a dedicated network. It's super easy to exhaust the pipe at this scale. It happens very quickly. Another thing that was a big surprise for us was that for some of the data, we have them on spinning disk, and we were worried that this would really be a big bottleneck, right? But for the preparation being the most intensive part, the way it does that, it's mostly doing statting, and that could actually fit in the cache. So it actually worked really well. We haven't seen any problems with that. So if you have that, I think it's going to work. I mentioned the automated way to move things between agents. I think that's super important. You really can get things kind of bunched up and bundled up if you have an unexpected long sync going for a particular file system. The other thing is that at this scale, really test on small things first. It's hard to back something out. If you run, it's very easy to run this on a large scale, and if you do that wrong, if you have misconfigured something, it's going to take you a long time to kind of get out of that, right? When we're talking about the metadata and doing that, outside of DataSync, I'm actually not discouraging you from doing that. I think that's a very viable way to get a large amount of data up. Just make sure you have the metadata. Just look at what the metadata is supposed to look like, and that will work. But I can't stress that enough. Another thing that we did, and that Paul mentioned about the storage classes, was that we were initially thinking that we're going to use lifecycle rules to move the data between different storage classes, and we quickly realized that that's not viable, actually. When we, at least for our use case, we have a lot of files, and a lot of files are actually small as well, and lifecycle rules cannot be filtered on size. It's not one thing that's part of the filter, right? And it's not very cost efficient to put a lot of very small files into Glacier or into Deep Archive. The good thing here is that DataSync does actually look at size when it moves things into store classes. So one recommended way here is do that as you actually move it in, right? And that's DataSync take care of that part of it.